if there are hostages in those tunnels, that's going to be incredibly hard to find because they're not. It's not like one network where they're all connected. There's little branch tunnels everywhere. 57,000 tunnel entrances in Gaza. So if they're in the tunnels, incredibly difficult to locate. And to be really brutal about it, there may just be small body parts left. There might just be a bit of jawbone or a bit of femur or whatever it might be, and finding a small bone in a densely populated enclave with 2 million people in it, it's not easy. So there's all these different factors that go into it, or there could be the kind of flanker here, and it could just be that Hamas are playing games. And you can, the calculated sadistic evil of this group is impossible to underestimate. I can see a scenario where they're literally trying to get Israel to break the ceasefire.
Welcome to Inside Policy Talks, the podcast of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm Casey Babb, Director of the Promised Land. The Middle East is changing. Just 24 hours ago, all living hostages were returned to Israel. But Jerusalem is still working to secure the release of the remaining deceased hostages. And in a ceremonial show of unity, world leaders recently headed to Egypt for a peace summit last Monday in support of President Trump's plan to end the war in Gaza. It wouldn't be a stretch to say that it's been a historic week, but questions remain about the future of Hamas and what it will take to deliver long-term security to the region. With that said, there's no one I'd rather be speaking with about these things than Andrew Fox. Andrew served for 16 years in the British Army. He completed 3 tours in Afghanistan, including one attached to the U.S. Army Special Forces, as well as further tours of Bosnia, Northern Ireland, and the Middle East. He was a senior lecturer at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, teaching in the War Studies and Behavioral Sciences Department, teaching military theory and leadership to officer cadets in training. He is currently an associate fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, specializing in defense, the Middle East, and the psychology of disinformation. And he is an associate fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. He sits on the international advisory boards of NGO Monitor and the International Legal Forum. Before we get started, please remember to like and subscribe. It helps us reach more people with these ideas. Andrew Fox, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
I've given a bit of a snapshot of your background, but you have a incredibly impressive CV, and your expertise is pretty unique. So, can you just give people a bit of an overview of who you are and sort of how you came into this the way that sort of we know you today?
Yeah, so I was a soldier. I was an officer. I left as a major from our British parachute regiment. But while I was serving, I sort of invested in what was coming next. I was never going to be the guy that did 30 years and ended up a general. That was never what I joined to do. It was never the way I wanted things to pan out. I enjoyed the stuff in the field. I loved commanding soldiers, and then the army kind of tried to tie me down to a desk job. So I felt, something new would have been preferable to just doing desk jobs for 20 years. So I did a master's in war studies, focusing on Middle Eastern strategy. And then just after I left, I did another master's in psychology, part of which was looking at the psychology of disinformation. And really, I was teaching at Sandhurst, and a war started in the Middle East with loads of strategic questions and loads of disinformation. So it turned out I had quite a lot to say, and I'm just grateful that people wanted to hear it. And I ended up working for the Henry Jackson Society. I've managed to get into Gaza 3 times during the war, but I've also been into Lebanon, into captured Hezbollah tunnels up there. I've been on the front lines in Ukraine as well. So I've had a really interesting 12 to 18 months just visiting these war zones and then applying my various areas of expertise to try and make sense of them.
Was there something about October 7th, maybe it was on the 7th or in the months following, that was different to you, or that was unique, where it made you feel like, okay, I should be out there saying something, or this is a topic that people are getting wrong that I would like people to get right? Like, what was it about that particular day or attack or war that sort of moved you towards the direction that you're in now?
Yeah, I think it's what sets it apart for me is the anti-Semitism piece. That's kind of been almost like a secondary mission for me. So I've tried to help people make sense of what's happening on the ground at a tactical level. But also, I had Jewish friends. I was actually in Germany on the day of 7th of October, so I was watching. I was on a number of Telegram groups as part of my research work. I was seeing these horrific videos live streamed, but then the thing that really kind of put a fire under me was seeing the reaction on London streets that day, where people were celebrating this. And that really did change the way I saw the world. I was aware of anti-Semitism as a thing, as I'm aware of racism or you know sexism or whatever, but it didn't really affect me. It didn't really touch my life in any way, quite frankly. I'm not Jewish, I'm not Israeli. I was aware that my friends felt to a degree sensitive about it, but it wasn't the central thing of their life. But then I think seeing how deeply they were injured by not only what happened in Israel on 7th of October, but also how people in their own countries responded, that really made me take a very kind of I would say aggressive stand against anti-Semitism, where I don't like to see bullying. I don't like to see people feel not at home anymore in their own country. So I made it a bit of a mission of mine to be a voice of solidarity with not only innocent Israelis who are suffering, but also my Jewish friends back in the UK. And if that helps the diaspora worldwide, then that's been a big deal for me too.
Right. So speaking of the diaspora worldwide, I think it's fair to say over the last couple days, everybody's been glued to their TVs and their computers watching the news out of Israel. We're recording this on the morning of the 14th. So here in Ottawa, it's only really been about 24 hours since people started seeing hostages come back to Israel. That's all well and good and amazing, and I think it's finally given people, Israelis and Jews and decent people around the world, maybe a bit of a glimmer of hope or just a moment of reprieve where they can take a breath. But there's still a lot that's unsettled. Given your background and your expertise, when you look at the totality of the situation, what are your thoughts in terms of the next several months, maybe even the next couple of years? Where are things right now, and where do you think they're headed?
Okay, let's start with where we're at. And I think
Hmm.
where we're at is in a relatively good place. The bombs have stopped falling in Gaza, the hostages who were alive are home. That enables healing, certainly in Israeli society. And actually, I've been to Israel 7 times now since the war started. I've got going twice more later this month. And the last time I was there, I was struck by the change in mood and the deflated atmosphere. And, I've interviewed a lot of IDF soldiers who I stay in touch with. They were feeling pretty bad about going into Gaza City. The morale wasn't very high. And where we are today enables healing of a lot of those wounds. Um, and that's no bad thing. So I think if that's all we get out of what's happened over the last week, that's no bad thing on a purely human level. When we look at the wider problem of kind of the Israel-Palestine question, I think we have to take a really long view here, because this is not something that happened from 7th of October onwards. It's an 80-year question that's been asked time and time and time again. Am I confident that this is the time that we're going to completely resolve the problem? In all honesty, no, I'm not. There are no simple answers to very, very complex problems. The big unresolved question for me right now is Hamas. What are the chances of them actually being removed from power? I'd say 50-50, but are they going to be removed from influence? Zero chance of that happening. And that's a question I don't think the Trump deal, the details we've certainly got at the moment, it's not something that Trump deal answers. But more details may come out. There's so many variables here, and that's why this is such a difficult question to answer, because you've got the Hamas question, you've then got the attitudes and dispositions of wider Palestinians, you've got the Israeli political side of life. Is there any viable candidate to run in the next election who can see their way to a Palestinian state? Is that even a real reasonable thing to ask of Israel after only 2 years since 7th of October? What about the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, or whatever you want to call it? That question is huge and completely unanswered, because a Palestinian state causes significant geographical strategic questions for Israel. I've said this in interviews over the last 24 hours a couple of times, that if you stand on the high ground around Jerusalem and look west, you can see the Mediterranean. That's how narrow Israel is. And you're asking them to accept an enormous strategic vulnerability by giving that land over to a group of people who demonstrably still want their destruction. So there's all kinds of really really, really difficult to answer, tricky, complicated, interconnected variables here that I don't think can be solved in one deal, and it's going to take a long period of time to get to an
Yeah.
answer if we ever do.
Yeah. One thing that is now sort of starting to, you know, bubble to the surface, or that's starting to now, people are turning their attention to it. Okay, so the living hostages are back. Naturally, people are going, okay, well, all the deceased hostages were supposed to be returned as well, and now it seems like there's 4 or 5, or it's very unclear. I'm reading this morning that there is a team in from Egypt trying to help locate the remains of deceased hostages. It's a nightmarish situation. Now, you've been to Gaza. I've studied Gaza from afar. I don't know if the average person can appreciate sort of how complex the terrain is in Gaza, how densely populated it is, how many tunnels there are, how many buildings there are. How could something like this happen? Like, and you've been in conflict zones many, many times. The average person's probably going, well, what do you mean they can't find the bodies? What do you what do you make of that? And do you think, as a second question here, do you think Israel might have to feel like they have to go back in to get those remains out?
Yeah, finding them is going to be the hardest part because that there wasn't just Hamas on 7th of October. There was other militant groups. There was thousands of civilians that went over and took hostages. And when you look at the images you've seen on social media of devastated parts of Gaza, like that's not made up. That's accurate. It's absolutely ruined. The last time I was in Gaza was maybe 2 months ago now, maybe a little bit less, and we were in southern Rafah, and there's honestly nothing recognizable as a building in parts of Rafah. It's just twisted girders and piles of rubble, and there's nothing that resembles those square buildings you would expect to see. And even the ones when you stand on some of the higher ground and you look towards the areas that are where there are recognizable buildings, they're all damaged. So the destruction has been massive here. The tunnel network is huge. 500 kilometers. That's to remind people, that's longer than the length of the London Underground. It's longer than the New York City Metro. It's longer than the subway. It's longer than the Paris Metro. This is quite a remarkable feat of architecture, if we're honest, engineering. The Hamas built that many tunnels underneath their whole area of governance is astonishing. And it's one of the sadnesses of this war is what they could have done if they'd put that effort into something productive rather than trying to destroy Israel. It's one of the great unanswered questions of our time, I suspect. But if there are hostages in those tunnels, that's going to be incredibly hard to find because it's not like one network where they're all connected. There's little branch tunnels everywhere. 57,000 tunnel entrances in Gaza. So if they're in the tunnels, incredibly difficult to locate. And to be really brutal about it, there may just be small body parts left. There might just be a bit of jawbone or a bit of femur or whatever it might be, and finding a small bone in a densely populated enclave with 2 million people in it, it's not easy. So there's all these different factors that go into it, or there could be the kind of flanker here, and it could just be that Hamas are playing games. And you can, the calculated sadistic evil of this group is impossible to underestimate. I can see a scenario where they're literally trying to get Israel to break the ceasefire, just by
Right.
playing these games, because then they can continue what they've done for 2 years, which is aim to survive and condemn Israel on the international stage. Because if Israel go back in, it'll be spun straight away as Israel's fault. And you're seeing that narrative being trailed by Gazan, quote unquote journalists. That's being put on social media right now. That we're seeing drones, we're seeing helicopters. The Israelis deny it clearly, but they're seeding the ground for this stuff. So that's a possibility as well.
Yeah. Speaking of narratives, something that you've talked about quite a bit, you talked about it on trigonometry, and I would encourage folks to go listen to that episode that you did with them. It was phenomenal. Is the narrative, pardon me, around famine and the distribution of aid and access to aid. This is something that people have been seized with. I mean, I had a neighbor here in Ottawa almost 2 years ago put a sign in his front window that said the Israelis are using food as a weapon. I mean, this is everybody's talking about this, and I think it's difficult for people to know what to believe, what's truth, what's fiction. Can you walk us through that a little bit? That the whole claim of deliberate starvation and famine, and what you've seen, and because you had a unique opportunity to sort of unpack that a bit in one of your visits to Israel.
Yeah, so I was fortunate enough to be the first neutral international observer to go to a Gaza Humanitarian Foundation site. So I got to see one of their aid distributions, um, from start to finish. And I also got to meet a lot of Gazans, which is something that very few people during this war have done. And I could get a sense for kind of who they were and how they were. Um, did I see anything resembling that kind of Biafran famine where you've got, ribs for xylophones for ribs, and, cheekbones completely hollowed out? No, nothing like that whatsoever. Think back to those photos of Holocaust survivors who were famine victims, nothing approaching that. But I think it's not. It would be fair to say that there have been a number of people in certain pockets of Gaza where food hasn't reached them. But the really big question is, why not? Because we know from the UN's own figures that enough food went into Gaza during the war for every single man, woman, and child. Like, it's beyond question. Over 3,000 calories per person per day went into Gaza during the war. So why on earth wasn't food reaching people? Well, first of all, it's a war zone. It's notoriously a difficult thing, for food to be distributed whilst bullets are flying and bombs are being dropped. That's really hard. So that's a straight thing. You'd expect to see a degree of difficulty there. But then we know that as many as 95% of UN aid convoys were getting intercepted before they reached their destinations. You had clans seizing them, you had militants seizing them, you had ordinary civilians swarming the food trucks. So the UN's, again, it's there for the UN's figures. I'm not taking it from a journalist report or the Israelis. This is just what the UN have told the world. So there are difficulties of distributing food in the war zone. But even by Hamas's own figures, which aren't reliable, I think it's about 450 roughly people have died of malnutrition related reasons during the war, which doesn't come anywhere close to famine threshold in an enclave of 2+ million people. There is another question here, though, is the narrative around famine has been really interesting. And the phrase that really caught on right back in October 23 was 500 trucks a day. Gaza needs 500 trucks a day of food to survive. When you dig into that, it's got absolutely no foundation in anything.
Right.
It was Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the UN, who just said it in an interview. And that went round the world before anyone had done their proper journalistic checks. It was closer to about 70 trucks of food a day before the war.
Wow.
That was needed. When you actually look at the figures, when you take off, the trucks that went in that didn't have food on, when you look at the amount of actual food trucks that went in, it was about 70 to 75, depending on the day. It's been over 140 trucks a day since the war started on average. So they've doubled the food income, the food intake for Gaza. And even if you account for the fact that local production has been destroyed, that only accounted for something like 22%, I think it was, of food in Gaza before the war. So in terms of overall calories, they're literally on double what they had before before 7th of October. But it's very interesting, I think, that this narrative took hold so early. Israel's, deliberately starving, and that's where we see the information war coming into play. So when they're, later in the war, nearly 2 years in, when there are genuine pockets of Gaza that are hungry, that narrative has already been seeded, and you can then, run with something that people already know. And psychologically, that's really, really easy to do. Once the narrative's set, you can just keep that narrative going.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, narratives and sort of dispelling myths. Another big issue that people have been trying to wrap their heads around, and I'm one of those people from time to time. There's a lot of information out there and a lot of disinformation. We hear that, okay, so the Palestinians voted for Hamas overwhelmingly when they were elected. Okay, that's true. Then we're also told that Hamas does not represent the Palestinians. Okay. Then we'll see videos of Hamas executing Palestinians. We'll see videos of Palestinian sort of gangs or clans that are armed, which we're told are maybe rising up against Hamas. What's your sense of that dynamic right now? Because as I'm sure that you've seen in the last 24 to 48 hours, there are already new videos circulating of what appear to be Hamas terrorists executing Palestinian civilians in Gaza. So, where do the Palestinians stand from your perspective and your interactions with Palestinians in how they view Hamas? And what role do you think they'll have, sort of, in, if we want to think of it as, disbanding or dismantling Hamas?
Yeah, and that's a really tricky question because one of the features of Hamas is their control of information. So one thing we could try and look at is the PCPSR polling that's been done intermittently throughout the war. And Hamas have seen a drop in support. They were 70, 80% at the start of the war. They're now down to kind of low 40%. How accurate that is, we don't know, because obviously Hamas people will give answers not wanting to be executed by Hamas. And on those execution videos, Hamas themselves have released those. So it's very, very clearly Hamas trying to take back control of the Strip. Now, there have been, it's a clan-based culture. The whole of Palestine is a clan-based culture where you have, sort of the West Bank areas like Ramallah and Nablus have a really kind of high kudos or high social standing. Gaza is always at the bottom. Like people from the West Bank like frown on their children marrying Gazans because that's the absolute bottom of the pile. But there are clans within Gaza as well. And we know that Israel has armed some of those and sort of helped them try to re-establish areas of control that Hamas don't have the final say in. But unfortunately, they're pretty small. So now the Israelis, under the ceasefire plan, have moved back. Those clans are now incredibly vulnerable to Hamas reprisals because Hamas still have the numbers to kind of dominate them. We've seen fights at Gaza ports. We've seen the various execution videos, and it's very clear that Hamas is flexing its muscles to show that it's still, to show kind of not only their backers and supporters, mainly in the Middle East, because it's about projecting strength in the Middle East. That's one of the key things you have to do. But also show ordinary Gazans that they are still daddy. They are still the top dog in the Gaza Strip. Yes, they were the elected government of Gaza, but that election was 2005. They haven't had one since. And at the start of the war, 50% of the population of the Gaza Strip was below 18 years old. So, very few people have actually voted for them. But the bigger issue, I think, is what Onat Wilf calls Palestinianism, which goes beyond Hamas and is this idea of from the river to the sea. It's not about having your independent Gaza Strip or your independent West Bank and a Palestinian polity. It's about getting rid of Israel and replacing it with this brand new country called Palestine that's never existed before. Think back to they talk about the 1967 borders all the time, but prior to 1967, Gaza was owned by Egypt and the West Bank was owned by Jordan.
Right.
That's why it's called the West Bank.
Yeah.
So it's very, very difficult to gauge Hamas's actual support because they can enforce, they can make people support them by pointing a gun at their heads. But the bigger problem here is the idea of Palestinianism, and I would suggest that's got a near 100% approval rating across the Palestinian territories.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so Palestinianism, Onat Wilf, we understand that, but a lot of people are probably not thinking about that sort of ideology and it's the way that it is connected to Iran and the way that it is almost an engineered, to a certain extent, product, ideological sort of worldview that has been engineered by Tehran, by the Islamic Republic. What do you think is in the cards for a potential round two with Iran? Because that hasn't been squared away. Iran is not, hasn't been decimated. We hear things about potential nuclear capabilities still being, on the table. Again, it's very unclear to people what we should expect in that region. Do you think that that's something that's on the table? Will that be part of sort of getting rid of Hamas and maintaining that security in Gaza and Lebanon and other territories? Or is your assessment that we probably won't see a sort of hot conflict between Israel and Iran again for many years?
Certainly not for 3 years. I don't think they'll risk it while Trump has now proven that he's willing to press the button and
Right.
deploy US bombers. They'd be very foolish, I think, to try and push things again whilst there's still kind of that approach in the White House,
Yeah.
which may give us 7 years if another Republican wins. In what are we on, 2028 or 29, whichever
Right.
year the election is. The the kind of Palestinian piece when it comes to Iran is a bit interesting because it's more of a Soviet creation than anything else. It came into being with Yasser Arafat in 1964, and that's when this narrative developed. But Iran has seen it as a useful tool because they have this crazy idea about the Mahdi coming back to Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem, and it needs the state of Israel to fall before that can happen. So they've got a really weird niche idea about Islam, and it's intricately tied to their entire theology as the destruction of Israel, which will then lead to the destruction of the great Satan, which is the United States of America, with Israel being the little Satan. So their intentions are going nowhere whilst the regime in Tehran stands. And I looked in detail at regime change kind of signifiers and things to look for during the Israel-Iran war. High-level defections or key leaders fleeing, that sort of thing. We saw none of it, and actually, the regime was incredibly effective at locking down power in Iran almost as soon as the ceasefire was over. They've got a very good sort of domestic security force who I was seeing reports from the ground in Iran where moving around from A to B was almost impossible because every junction had these security force guys just locking down movement and making sure that no rebel or no resistance force could coalesce in enough numbers to make any sort of significant challenge against Khamenei and his mob. So the regime's relatively stable. That they're suffering under sanctions, and that might be a factor that could trigger regime change. But ultimately, without regime change in Tehran, we're not going to see an end to their ambitions. But that comes with the caveat, of course, that we've tried regime change in the Middle East on a number of occasions in the last, in the 21st century, and they've all been disastrous. So it may be a case of better the devil you know.
I have two more questions for you, Andrew. The first is, as somebody who has studied war much more than most other people, when you pull back and you look at the last 2 years, not just in terms of what Israel has done in Gaza, but the way that they've been able to sort of dismantle their adversaries in multiple parts of the Middle East, how do you think that this has changed the way will be fought and won or lost? Are there lessons that you're thinking about that can be teased out from this, or maybe not? Maybe this again is just war, and war is hell, and that's the Israelis are just good at handling what they need to handle. Maybe that's the answer. But curious what your take is.
Well, I'm smiling slightly because my boss is going to think that I planted that question with you, but I can promise Alan that I didn't, because I've got a 21,000 word paper on this exact topic coming out sort of end of the month, early November. Yeah, it's called Lessons for Western Militaries from the IDF in Gaza, and actually there's huge amounts of stuff that we can take away from the way they've conducted those campaigns. Now, I think Lebanon and Iran kind of stand alone. There's not a huge amount to learn, except that the F-35 is very, very effective against Russian air defense systems, which is a great thing to know. Because I remember back sort of 2013-14, we were doing with the RAF, mock battle simulations, and the RAF were really worried about the level of casualties they'd take off those Russian air defenses. And the Israelis just wiped them aside without taking a scratch. So that's a really good lesson that we should all be pretty reassured about. But when it comes to Gaza, that was hard block to block, yard by yard urban combat in a very complex environment, because it wasn't just the buildings in front of you, it was the buildings in front of you that are now rubble. So your maps no longer apply to the ground. You had a 360-degree threat in every possible direction, sort of ground level, above ground, below ground. The Israelis perfected simultaneous above and below ground maneuver. which is something no other army in the world can do, quite frankly. So there's a huge amount to learn there. And then what the Israelis did really well in Gaza was what we call, in military terms, adaptation in contact, because they weren't ready on 7th of October. They were nowhere near ready to fight the battle that they fought. And the way they fought at the end was very different to the way they fought at the start, because they learned and adapted as the war was ongoing. And their ability to adapt has been incredibly impressive. And there's a reason for that. And it's to do with the way they capture lessons learned and disseminate them across the whole force, and even do things like implement tactical pauses to learn this new lesson and before carrying on with the fight. So yeah, there's been some remarkable lessons there. And we have to be very careful of saying that because war A was like this, then war B will also be like this, because we look at Ukraine and it's fought very differently there. You've got these screens of drones that kind of create whole lockdowns of the fighting front just by using $200 FPV drones at mass scale. And that's going to change the way we fight too. So we have to take these lessons from Gaza as Western militaries, look which ones apply, which ones don't, and then, be careful in that application. But yeah, there's tons to take away from the idea.
Last question for you, Andrew. Maybe it's a tricky one, maybe it's not. Decades from now, people are still going to be coming up to you. People are going to ask you, whether it's in your home or cocktail receptions or universities. They're going to say, "Well, what stands out to you from those couple of years? Like, what do you remember most? What is it that you think that will stay with you most from these last 2 years that you've seen? Maybe it was something you saw in Gaza. Maybe it's something that somebody said to you. But it's been a really extraordinary couple of years with a lot of ups and downs. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that."
That's a really tough question. I think I'll go for the really personal answers, because I think that's probably the most resonant. And the first one is the privilege of standing alongside my Jewish friends, and the kind of the Jewish community standing with me in turn, because it's a bit of a wild ride on social media. Death threats and being called every name under the sun on a daily basis isn't wildly pleasant. And the kind of I've received back uh, in kind of moral support 100 times over everything I've given out. So that will stay with me as a very special thing. And then probably the hostage returns yesterday. That was, I put on Twitter just 2 words. It was "and exhale." And I don't think I'd realised the extent to which I'd been holding my breath for 2 years in many ways. I've been friends with hostage families, like ALS Fatitsky, her brother, and two of her brothers were killed in as hostages. Her mother was taken and later released. The family of Emily Damari, I've met them a few times. Omri Moran, his family I've met. And so particularly seeing Omri come home yesterday, I must confess I did shed a tear to see him and Lishay reunited. That was a very, very special thing to see. So yeah, probably those two things.
Well, Andrew, thanks for taking the time. And on a personal note, exactly to your point, as a Jew, you've been, I can say that you've meant a lot to the community worldwide. One of the most sort of, one of the clearest voices, one of the most consistent voices. And you've been a gift to the community when they needed it most. So thanks for coming on the podcast, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
That's really lovely. And thank you very much. I appreciate it.